Hi, it's Jan Howell, and welcome back to the So Simple series, lesson number 4. In this class, we're going to be going over some basic sewing machine seams and talking about the seam allowance. When you sew two pieces of fabric together, you create a seam. And whatever project you're making or whatever garment or clothing you're making, you're going to have a lot of seams, and there's different ways of finishing those seams and creating those seams. We're going to go over just the basics. The first seam we're going to go over is that you'll use with most of your craft projects, most of your sewing projects, unless they call for a finished edge or a finished seam. Each sewing project that you do will call for a particular seam allowance, and they range anywhere from an 1/8 inch seam allowance to a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Sometimes you'll have bigger, but whatever project you'll have, the instructions will tell you what seam allowance to use. If you're not sure, just use a basic 3/8 seam allowance, which is just the edge of your presser foot. So if I were to lift up my presser foot and put my presser foot down, the edge of the fabric would be along the edge of my presser foot, unless you have a presser foot on your sewing machine that is a 1/4 inch presser foot for quilting and things. So I find that I use a 3/8 inch seam allowance on most of my projects, unless it calls for something else. So your sewing machine is going to have on the plate different indicators of seam allowances and measurements. And depending on where your needle is, so on this particular sewing machine, there's different needle positions. As you can see, this straight stitch is right in the center, where this one is off to the left. If I were to push that one, my needle moved over to the left, and that will affect your seam allowance. So just make sure the needle is in a centered position. On this manual machine, this is the needle position. You can move it over to the left or to the right. You want to make sure that it is in the center. The reason you would move that to the left or to the right would be putting a zipper in or having a different seam allowance, special seam allowance. So let's go over the settings on your machine for a regular stitch. Adjust the length of the stitch to 2.5, and the width you'll want to make sure it's on 0. I have threaded my machine, and I'm just going to be sewing on a blue thread so that you can see the contrast. Just one thing I want to mention that I didn't before is you want to make sure that the thread is pulled back before you start sewing. Lift up your presser foot. Place it back down on the fabric where you need to start the seam. A little trick you can do to keep your needle from unthreading at the beginning of your sewing is just to turn your hand wheel towards you and bring the needle down into the fabric, and then you can start sewing. To make sure the seam does not come undone, you'll want to backstitch at the beginning of the seam, at the end of the seam, unless it tells you not to do it. So begin sewing. Push the backstitch button wherever that is on your machine, and then continue to stitch. And I'm just watching the edge of the fabric so it stays aligned with the edge of my presser foot. And I'll hit the backstitch. And this machine automatically clips my thread. Make sure that when you end your seam, if that doesn't have that automatic feature, that your needle is in the upright position, or else it will tangle. That's a basic seam allowance and seam. So some projects you won't need to finish the edges because there's no worry about it fraying. If you do need to finish those edges, I will have a tutorial and we'll go over different ways that you can finish those edges if you don't have a serger. You can do this on your regular sewing machine. A trick that I like to do occasionally is take a piece of masking tape and apply it. Say I have a 1-inch seam allowance. Just place that where the 1 inch is, and then when I sew, I can have this guide. You can do this with any seam allowance. Just helps to keep your fabric lined up as you sew. If your project calls you to press the seam open, just take the iron and open up the seam allowance and press, and it will look like this. The next seam we'll cover is a flat felt seam. This is a seam like your jeans will have. It's a little bit more secure, and we'll go over the unfinished flat felt seam first and then a finished. The flat felt seam calls for a 5/8 inch seam allowance. To make that easier for me to see, I'm just going to take my tape and place that on my sewing machine so I have a better guide to follow. Make sure your threads are pulled back to start with. Come to the edge of your fabric, put your presser foot down, and begin to sew. Back stitch. I'm going to open up that seam and press the seam to one side. Pull it so it's tight. Then I'm going to flip it over, and on the side where my seam allowance is, I'm going to come away just 1/8 of an inch and sew a straight seam down. So your presser foot will also have little indicators of the seam allowance. So there's little notches, one for the center and 2 off to the side that are 1/8 of an inch. So I'm going to find that 1/8 of an inch and line that up with the fold of that seam. Pull my threads back and start stitching. It's going to do a back stitch for me automatically. And I'm just eyeing and watching that little indicator right there that it's staying on the fold. So this is what it will look like on top of the garment and on the back. You have this unfinished edge and your seam. You'll find this stitch on your jeans and your denims. It's a more secure seam and very durable. Now let's show you how to do a finished felt seam. I'm just going to do another seam. Except this time I'm going to open it up and trim away some of the fabric of the right seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to fold the seam allowance over the cutoff seam allowance. Now to finish this off so it doesn't fray and gives a more finished look, I'm going to fold that seam allowance under 1/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and stitch just right inside that fold and top stitch that. So before I begin, if you want to see where your needle is going to go into the fabric, I like to turn my hand wheel toward me again. Make sure you're where you want to be and start stitching. And this is what it'll look like on the wrong side, and on the right side, that is what it will look like. You can also have the double stitching on the outside of your garment if you wanted to. It depends what look you want. The next seam we'll cover is the French seam. This is another finished edge seam, something that you would want to use on sheer fabrics, lace, or I use it on my pillowcases. So one of the things that's different on a French seam, instead of placing the right sides together when you sew a seam, you start by sewing the right sides facing out and the wrong sides together. So I have just scribbled on these fabric pieces to show you this is the right side. That would be the print of a fabric. So I'm going to put the wrong sides of the fabric together first and sew my seam. The first seam is only going to be a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Take it to the ironing board and open it up so the right side of the fabric is facing up, and press the seam to one side. Pull it so you're getting a nice tight fold there. And then I'm going to place the right sides together. Make sure that's flat and press. And then we'll take it back to the sewing machine and sew a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So I just take it back to this ironing board and press that open. Just pressing the seam to one side or the other. Another way to have a nice finished edge for your garment, pillowcase, pillow, whatever you need to have that finished edge. So there you have it, a basic seam, an unfinished flat felt seam, a finished flat felt seam, and a French seam. Make sure you're subscribing to the channel. If you like the video and would like more tutorials like this, make sure you're giving it a thumbs up, and we'll see you in the next class.